All right. So the first thing is, I think in the 2AR, you're spending a lot of time answering framework, and he very clearly says he's not going for the interpretation of framework. So I think you are spending a lot of time on an argument that you don't need to be addressing, because he's no longer making arguments in the 2NR about why you should lose because you don't fiated, a topical version of the plan. And I would really like to vote on the analysis for them having done that prior, because he basically says we're not going for it anymore, so therefore it should go away. But you don't give any arguments for why they should be rejected for having done that in its entirety. Instead, you just sort of say framework's problematic, it shouldn't be rejected, I have a better interpretation for debate, etc., etc. And all of that is great. It gets you past framework, and you would have won the framework debate, but they're not going for framework. So I don't see what that gets you in this round unless you do the work that explains that this is an example of how they're even when they kick out of it, that's still an example of the institutionalization of norms for where debaters could feel like they could, put these rules upon us and then withdraw these rules as they decide because there's a better strategic option, right? And so him kicking out of framework doesn't get you out of the offense of what you're putting on framework initially. And I think the 2NR needs to be more careful given the way that it's answered earlier in the debate, because they are saying that you're upholding a very structured norm, and I get that you're saying that you're doing it in some sort of critical way, but they're still accusing you of doing the norm, and when you just sort of move on from there, I think that there's a lot of leeway for them to be able to utilize that offense as a reason to reject you. All right, so that's my first meta comment. My second thing is that I think the Ghostbuster thing is clever, but they're trying to keep ghosts alive opposed to kill ghosts, so I think it's literally the opposite of what they're saying, right? Because we have to be talking to the ghosts opposed to trying to bury the ghosts. And I think when you say the ghosts are the root cause of the problem, is not the best way to phrase that, because that makes it seem like ghosts are bad and we want to get rid of the ghosts, which is why they're talking about ghost busting. So when you say, when they ask you what's the root of the problem, you say, well, it's patriarchy and ghosts. It's the attempt to try to lay the ghosts to rest that are the problem, because every time we try and lay ghosts to rest, that's when it comes back to haunt us, because we're constantly trying to, get rid of a form of oppression, and then as soon as we believe that we've gotten rid of it, it continues to come back and to get us further. And so the attempt to try and take mastery over those things that oppress us is the root of the problem, because that is another attempt at mastery. And so when you say it's just ghosts, it makes it difficult for you to articulate, your conversation to ghosts. And I think that that's one of the key things that, the slippage happens in the 1NR and then happens, all over sort of the 2NR in cross-examination. I think that that creates a unique problem. And I think that when you're explaining the alternative, it can't just be so we talk to ghosts. Yeah, we speak to ideology. That's pretty cool. And then 2NR, I think the 1NR does a little bit better job of sort of contextualizing. But even still, in the 1NR, when you're going for the criticism, I want to know why allowing these ghosts to live and continue to exist here isn't just allowing patriarchy to run rampant and all these other problems to run rampant, and why shouldn't we take strides to try and do something with them, right? And so the idea of speaking or seancing is that once we figure out what really ails the ghosts, and the ghosts will go away on their own opposed to us trying to lay them to rest. So first we have to understand what ails patriarchy. Why is patriarchy coming to haunt us and continues to destroy us? And through that process of examination and accepting of that, are we able to finally sort of allow patriarchy to evaporate on its own merits opposed to allowing for this to take place? And that links up really well with your stuff about how we have to have passivity and the other sorts of cards that you have in the debate, but you're not necessarily doing the alternative work. And I think that's good. You're pushing them on they don't have an effective alternative, and I think that's useful. But I think you also need to have offense against that alternative, right? You always have to assume the best version of the argument, and so even if he doesn't do a great job, you should be reading arguments against that, right? There's plenty of Baudrillard and Derrida indicts out there. There's a lot of people who write about Derrida in relationship to ghosts in response to his Spectres of Marx book, which I don't know if that's the one they're quoting from. But Derrida's Spectres of Marx book talks about ghosts. And how we allow things to continuously haunt us. So it is that book? Yeah, so there's lots and lots that is written about against that book. And so you should, get some sites against that, and, it criticizes that. And I think that, that, and then with the Baudrillard index, you're going to have some sort of offense against the alternative, because, you need that in the round, and they don't do a great job of sort of explaining that. But I don't vote on the ghost stuff, anyhow. What I do end up voting negative, and the two arguments that I end up voting negatives is the on the case debate, it's the UC Berkeley evidence that was read in the block, conceded in the 1AR, extended in the 2NR, conceded again in the 2AR, that indicates that the academy is not going to care about your disruption. In fact, it's just going to use it in order to continue to champion itself, which is either a presumption you don't solve anything, or a potential you get co-opted type argument, and make the situation worse. And I think the 2NR, and this is why I spent a lot of time here, is because your overemphasis on presumption undercuts your ability to explain how your evidence is actually like impact turns to their affirmative, and they make the situation worse. It's not just that they don't solve, but the academy will turn them, will take them in, spit them out, and so that way, new gender studies departments will emerge, just so that way the academy can get more money. But the way they do that, they fund more football programs or frat programs that continue to recreate patriarchy, or whatever your scenario wants to be for how the academy utilizes feminist scholarship, or their form of speaking in a way that compartmentalizes them along those lines, right? And I think that it would make it a lot easier for me to vote, because then I don't have to just rely on them not solving, especially if I don't think you're doing a great job with the alternative. You're really getting me to vote on they're doing something bad, and so it's really difficult to get the judge to vote on presumption. And then the second argument that I vote on is a argument that is on the framework debate page, but is not related necessarily to framework, which is the Bilfo evidence, which indicates that when we utilize tools such as debate that already are pre-existent, that ends up just getting co-opted within that system, and that resistance falls short. Not only that card evidence doesn't say not only does the resistance fall short, but actually destroys radical potentials of those things, because you're doing it within the spaces that are able to quickly identify you in order to be able to destroy you. And so then it becomes a question of like, so when you say, we're breaking down that system, within here, you're identifying for me within the space of debate how you're trying to break down that system, so that way I could then be able to exert that power in order to be able to stop that form of resistance which takes place within that structure, right? And so, the reason why it's on the framework page is because the evidence says that instead of having, radical forms of resistance where we refuse to use the master's tools, we should accept passivity instead. And passivity will not allow the master to realize how we're resisting within the current house, right? So that's why it's consistent, why they say using the state would be a beneficial tactic in this instance. But I think that if you look to those internals of the card, you could be able to tell a pretty convincing story that them telling women to be passive at the end is that same old, like, the master saying, well, if you could just, remain invisible somewhere within this room, just in the way that women have always remained invisible in the debate, then somehow your resistance will be able to come, because nobody will know what you're doing. But as you say, not unique on the outflow, no one's going to know what we're doing anyhow and stuff like that. But this piece of evidence indicates that it undermines that radical potential. And so you need to, so like, when you're like, hey, judges have come up to us in order for us to say, like, you've made change, right? The analysis I wish you would have, but the implication of how it would become worse is that allows those judges to give themselves a pat on the back, is that I didn't sexualize you in this round, so I'm going to really try harder, and and that will make me a good man, and so then I don't have to worry about the other ways I participate in these systemic forms of things. So it just makes it underwrite, and that's like that's how you change it from presumption to offense, is by giving those, like, that additional level, those arguments. And so that would be the part that you need to be inserting in the 2NR. But he does get to the part where it says that by making it hypervisible, then it ends up being destroyed within the system and destroys those radical potentials. So I don't necessarily have to get to fully turning the case, because it does undercut your ability to solve. And then your examples are just examples of where you become visible for people to come out as like, hey, championed you, now debate's changed. But really, as you point out in your affirmative, debate's still inherently like a patriarchal activity. So, all of your triumphing has created the same sort of, structure, unless you suddenly, which is a little bit counterintuitive, if you start making reformism good arguments, right? It's like, yeah, debate's patriarchal, but we have changed 2 or 3 judges. This reformism is an ongoing process, and these small cracks to eventually then break down that master's house, and we're going in the reformist position. But you articulate it as a radical gesture that is a complete break by burying all the things of patriarchy from the past, and then we could, and only once we fully bury it can we actually realize these things. That that rhetoric almost works well with their criticism, because it also creates the situation where that you can't fully assert your own agency until patriarchy is fully buried. But your criticism at the same time is that it can't be fully buried, right? So in a sense, like, if I would vote on the ghost argument, that would be the link that I'd be voting on, is the way in which you're trying to just bury it to then have your speaking position. But I think that argument also works with their Belfo evidence, because it indicates that the belief that we have to entirely break out of that system just allows that system to realize what you're trying to do in order to crush it. So it's ultimately I don't see how you solve, and if you do solve, I think you potentially make the situation a little bit worse. And then, I spent a lot of time thinking about the ways in which you explain how you make it better, and the things that have been affected and that sort of thing. And I think that is probably your best argument in relationship to these things, because here is something that you've done, that you've said that has worked for you. And I think that what you should do when you're talking about like this is not a universal strategy, but it's what's for you. You should frame it as like a roll of the ballot based upon individual survival strategies or something to that effect. And so you don't have to defend a universalization of this, and their evidence is a little bit of universalizing but for them to say you have to embrace these things. That's saying you must do that. So like their universalization on the case debate that you create the sale of hatred, they're the ones who are then saying you have to do this one. Well, you're just saying I could do it for myself. So your burden is to prove that what you've been doing is a strategy that works for you. If that strategy works for you and has been working for you, how dare they say you've been co-opted within the system and you don't understand how you're being duped within the same sort of structure. And so the role of ballot is about being able to affirm what you bring to the table, and they would have to in that world prove for why that why it wouldn't be able to solve for you, or be able to prove why that would be a bad framework that forefronts things like survival. But by winning that, you do sort of win that it's good for you, but that being good for you does not necessarily radically change any of the systems debate. And so I think you need to have more of a role about directed towards that, because it allows me to be able to evaluate some of the meta effects of your advocacy, opposed to just sort of the effects of the micro advocacy that's taking place here. And I think that's the way to go about doing it. But I also think that if you clash directly in the 2AR with the two pieces of evidence that I'm seeing conceded, I think I could probably also end up voting affirmative, because I think you'll probably end up using the right arguments in those sort of portions of the debate about like how you are, challenging those sort of systems, but you just spend the bulk of your time answering it as if they're going for framework proper, which he at the top of the debate says he is not doing.
I just got confused because I thought the education fairness turns I should extend, apparently not.
Well, you should extend it, but you should only extend it if it's going to be offense against them. Otherwise, then I'm not sure why that responds to how the academy is going to crush you or any of that sort of stuff. But if it becomes this normalization that then oppresses you, then like them not going for framework suddenly becomes them undermining that education within debate, right? But if they're not going for framework, I don't know. Well, it's like you ran impact turns to the disad, they kicked out of the disad, and now you're talking about impact turns, and they've already conceded your no link. It's like they're not doing that anymore. But in the style of this sort of debate, I don't think they could just sort of like wish that entire thing away without having some more justification in the 2NR. So the 2AR has leeway to be able to, create that offense there.
That makes sense. The answers to the UC Berkeley stuff, could it be more along the lines like we don't produce anything for the academy to take? Because our argument is like if we did the survival strategy stuff, that it's like it's an embodiment, it's just for ourselves. So it's like the academy can't take it because we have done this for us. Yeah, that's certainly an answer. Obviously, their response is that the academy is going to co-opt the two of you and it's going to take what you think is for you and use your bodies in their way. But certainly, if you frame the ballot as it being about you, I don't have to care what the academy tries to do. And I always think it's a little bit like if you recognize the academy is always going to be utilizing you intellectually, for them to say you just don't do it, it sort of, almost makes you seem so naive that you don't understand these things are happening. But having an awareness of how these are happening and being okay with it because this is how you've chosen to navigate your lives through survival strategies become, it could be is a persuasive answer in my mind. That makes sense.
Yep.
How on the 2NR should I kick out of the framework in order to like protect myself from the impact turns coming back to haunt me?
Well, I think that, the first thing that you should do in terms of like, when kicking out a framework is that you could be more explicit that if you win your offense on the other flows, that their type of education being included in debate is a bad one, right? So if you win that their affirmative is a bad idea, then including it within debate is a bad idea, so exclusion of that would be good. So your offense could serve as a reason for why that should be pushed out of the debate round. You can also just make standard arguments. They don't make any conditionality arguments. They don't make any framework as unconditional arguments in the debate round up to this point, which means you're not necessarily beholden to that entirety of that interpretation. You could also figure out a reason for, like in instance in this debate, that when you let go of framework, that it's a letting go, and using frameworks as a way that you spoke to ghosts within this round, be able to explain the ways in which we could do this, but then you don't go for framework not as a reason to lay it to its death, but allow it to just continuously circulate here. So some sort of reason for why that kick out is legitimate given the in light of your other positions and stuff like that. And I think that you could also in this round, like the Belfo evidence, like the reason why it talks about how we have to be passive opposed to resistant. I mean, you could just, when you extend that evidence, you could also be like, and this will answer back any of their offense about education, because their radical breaks are all answered back by the passivity, which is a more radical act. So when they try and break from this, is always going to be bad. And so, like extending the offense that you had against that as reasons for why that the education stuff doesn't take place.
you should ask first.
Okay, the Bilfo evidence, the Benjamin card that we read, which is talking about like the master's tool, and when we just accept that logic, would that have been a good response to carry out in response to Bilfo?
That we shouldn't accept the master's logic.
Yeah.
Right. They're saying you are using the master's logic.
Okay. Yeah.
Because you're using debate. And so
For
debate is part of that master's logic. So you just being like, we're radical, we break away from that, but you're clearly in a debate round, right? And your 1AC was clearly criticizing debate as an institution. You are using the master's tool of debate, which is what the argument
That
is.
makes sense. Okay.
Right? So it's like, so when you say you're radical, that's giving them the link because you're working within that system. That works as a response to framework for why working within the system is good, but doesn't get you answering that question.
Makes sense. Thank you.
What are some ways we could answer that?
Well, some ways that you could answer that is, right, I mean, as I explained, that the evidence talked about how passivity is the answer, but then you can also talk about why debate is important for you to use as that tool, right? Like you have left behind a lot of master's tools, but you're still using the tool of debate and, right, Liberty University to get to the tournaments and everything like that. Like you admit in cross-examination, how'd you get here? Well, it's where my team went, right? But you didn't have to come here if you didn't want to travel with your team, right? I'm sure that there's repercussions for that, but you could have made that choice. But in any case, so if you explain why debate is important for you as that tool that you utilize, that's a response to that, opposed to them saying that, in the same way that, like in answer to UC Berkeley, why utilizing the academy is important for you, why using debate is important for you, then is your answer to why we shouldn't use that as a tool because it's just going to create a co-option.
And that interacts with sharp survival strategy.
Right, exactly. So if you set that up that way, that makes it a lot, that makes it easy selling, sort of answering both those positions simultaneously. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, the question I had was, did you find the sort of like Derrida hauntology argument, did you find that particularly persuasive?
I thought that the argument got better and better based upon the things that they were saying, because I think of maybe the misarticulation of ghost being bad. Because then they kept talking about how they will lay the ghost rest here, and then they will go over there, and they will lay those ghosts to rest, and we'll always find new ghosts in order to be able to put them down to solve it. And so, like, you both sort of point that out as being like, this is a problematic, is exactly what we're talking about. There's always going to be new haunting. So I think that it worked pretty well. And I think it does work naturally well as a burial app, because burials are about laying these sort of ghosts to rest to be able to move beyond it. So I do think that there is definitely clash within the position. I think it's the alternative level that's really missing in this debate, and so that's why I look elsewhere to resolve it. Because if I was going for that alternative, it seems like their story about how it's been able to, how they've seen change take place is more convincing to me than just, hey, we speak with it without an explanation of how that speaking takes place.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
I know you mentioned something about towards the end, thinking that if they solve, it probably makes the harms worse. Does that mean I did enough even without the alternative proving that a turns case analysis with the K, or was that just somewhere else?
Well, I'm looking elsewhere to get my turns right. I'm going to the Bilfo evidence and UC Berkeley evidence, which clearly, I mean, it definitely works in tandem with your ghost criticism, but I'm not voting on them laying stuff to rest as being bad because I have an easier way to go in these sort of situations. Because if I have to evaluate them laying stuff to rest being bad, and I'm versing that against your alternative without that case stuff, I'm not necessarily how your alternative resolves any of these sort of things, so you're not doing a good enough explanation of that, in which case I think I'd probably, say, even a risk that the affirmative might do something positive is going to be beneficial. And that's the problem when you phrase things in terms of presumption, is that there's a lot of judges who think, well, 0.01% chance risk, I vote AF. And so it's better if you could phrase it offensively, and each one of your positions is not just a presumption argument. And sure, you could say, even if you don't buy they make the situation worse, you could vote on presumption, but when you forefront presumption, it makes my world a whole lot harder, because then I have to be like, is there really zero solvency? Because any solvency, why not give it a go? And so, that's one way that speaker points would go up, if that 2 hour was talking about why I should be rejecting them because they make things worse, opposed to just being like, things are going to be the same. Because if things are the same, why not vote for them? It's the same, but who cares, right? And so I think that's useful. Yeah.
Quick question: if the analysis would have been done about how them kicking out of the framework is still an institutionalization of norms, how would that played into the final decision?
I think it would have voted against them because they are using norms to push you out of the space, which is problematic.
So the turns wouldn't have been enough.
I mean, I would have had to think, because it's still saying that you get included within debate isn't including with you in debate being good, but I mean, he doesn't really spend a lot of time explaining. He says at one point, our other things will still show why your app is bad. Sure, but that doesn't justify why we should exclude them from the get-go, right? It might say why I should vote against you on a substantive level, but it doesn't mean I should exclude you from ever entering this debate space because of a rule. And so I would probably use that your violent imposition of rule is what I'm going to vote down before I decide whether the affirmative is good or bad, because pushing that out, it becomes problematic. But you would need, you would need to do that work. So, because he just doesn't kick out of it in a way that's, very well. And I see this in a lot of debates, is that even when the app doesn't make framework unconditional arguments, I still think that you're able to get some traction there. And I never see 2NRs really kick out of them very persuasively at all. And so you just have to learn to be able to be like, even if they've kicked out of them, there's still a reason to vote against them, right?
That makes
And you know,
sense, yeah.
I'd probably make that argument explicit in the 1AR, but so that way there's a heads up so it doesn't come entirely new. But I think that given the 1AR's analysis about how these norms and how their use of norms are bad, like there's enough there that I would want to, that I don't think is kicked out sufficient for the